Julian Assange is the most famous journalist behind bars in the world.
But there's not much news coverage of Julian Assange's presence in Britain's maximum security Belmarsh prison, alongside Britain's worst terrorists and murderers.
To help make sense of it all, academic and leading trade unionist Dr Deepa Driver joins us now. Deepa, thank you for coming on board the Sputnik.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm really glad to be here to make the case for Julian Assange.
Deepa, I want to start, first of all, talking about the blackout when it comes to the mainstream media and the coverage of Julian Assange's trial and indeed imprisonment. Julian Assange has provided the mainstream media with column inches galore of material over the years in his whistleblowing, in his journalism. And so why do you think the media are so silent on the case?
I guess there has been a sea change in the way the media have covered the case of Julian Assange. So if you looked even in the last 5 years, there was what you say, which is this silence. But the tide has really turned, and at least at the hearings and indeed at the verdict in January, the mainstream media began to cover the case. And they began to cover the case quite tentatively. There were a few courageous fellow journalists who made some excellent points about what was going on and how much of a travesty the entire hearings were, and the way in which the hearings were conducted, the complete lack of due process, the absolute denial of any basic human rights to Julian and to those who were attending the trial to monitor it, attending the hearings rather. And that change was there for the duration of the hearings to some extent, and definitely at the verdict. There has been less, as you say, in terms of recognizing that, here we have the world's most important political prisoner, and during an international pandemic, he is being locked down 22 hours a day in a maximum security prison where he is only one of two prisoners, I believe, who's there for non-violent crime. And so-called crime, of course, because as we know, what he did was to reveal what the criminals were doing in terms of war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also crimes of powerful corporations like Trafigura, which was dumping toxic waste off the Ivory Coast. A lot of your listeners will probably be interested in the way in which WikiLeaks covered the TTIP, which is the kind of legislation which puts corporations in a powerful position over and above sovereign nation states and allows them to really control our economies and control how they are scrutinized. So yes, I do think the mainstream media has been lacking in courage, has been lacking in insight. And I must say that I am so delighted that much as I criticize the mainstream media, I'm glad to say The Guardian has taken an editorial position against the extradition of Julian Assange, so have other international media. And this is entirely through the work of activists and those within the campaign that we've begun to get some movement.
Well, you would expect and sincerely hope that The Guardian would do that. I mean, The Guardian covered so many WikiLeaks pieces, so much so that some of their hard drives, in fact, were taken away and destroyed. And so you'd certainly hope The Guardian, of all press outlets, would do so. But why is Julian being held in this maximum security prison on his own? I mean, it's designed so that the inmates literally can't see the sky, can't see the world around them. As you say, he's non-violent. So why do the government keep him there?
So yes, it is astonishing that despite Julian winning his hearing against extradition to the United States, District Judge Vanessa Berezza decided that she would deny him bail in order to, in her opinion, give the United States fair opportunity for contesting her decision. Now, you will remember that this is the same judge who who wanted to hear the case as soon as possible, because she said Julian was being held in this maximum security prison, and wasn't it in his interest for the case to be heard quickly, even when the United States indictment had not properly been served on him. And suddenly now she has no regard for the fact that he continues to stay in a maximum security prison, even though he's won his hearing. So I find that quite revolting and quite astonishing, but it is what you come to expect of the British state, because the British state has long been colluding with the United States to suppress Julian Assange, to suppress WikiLeaks, to suppress dissent. And most ordinary people have seen it very clearly during the COVID crisis, and particularly in relation to the demonstrations against the murder of Sarah Everard, particularly against the demonstrations against the protest bill, where the state has come down very heavily on individuals who choose to challenge how the state exercises its powers.
Deepa, what do we know of Julian Assange at this moment? Has he got access to lawyers? Has he got contact with his partner, his children? What do we know? What do we know about him? What are the circumstances in which he is now?
The last I heard, Julian had not seen his family since, for a very long time, since the start of the lockdown at Belmarsh. He had, the other issue is that he's not able to see his lawyers. You will recall that Gareth Peirce, the famous lawyer who defended the Birmingham Six and who's done a huge amount of work over the years in various human rights cases, is his primary lawyer. And she's the horrible thing about this case is Julian is being tried in a case where he would face 175 years in a US supermax, which is essentially a concrete cell with one hole which is opened once a day. And this is pre-trial.
Yeah.
But right now, he's not even being given proper access to his lawyers, which he would get if he were on bail and were able to meet them and were able to
incredible.
Organize. It's completely a travesty that this is going on in London, in Belmarsh, and none of the British newspapers are bringing themselves to cover it. Whereas yesterday I saw an interesting little piece, or revolting little piece, again in the BBC this time, talking about what Hugh Grant likes to eat at a little cafe in Somerset. So what qualifies it as news on the mainstream media nowadays is really astonishing to me, as no doubt it is to you. And The Guardian and the New York Times and the Washington Post have a lot to be ashamed of in terms of the way in which they bought into the imperialists' agenda to vilify Julian, to use to say he tormented his cats, to say he smeared feces on the wall, without recognizing that this is one of the most intelligent, capable, and the most powerful journalists who has a 100% record of accuracy, account that most other journalists would not be able to come anywhere near.
Now, Deepa, Julian is world famous, has given newspapers so very much in terms of content material from his whistleblowing over the years. And that's all come from a site called WikiLeaks, which I'm sure many of our viewers will have heard of, if not viewed themselves. Why is WikiLeaks and sites like it important?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking me that. So when Julian envisaged WikiLeaks, you will know that it was a time when newspapers were print papers largely. And when whistleblowers communicated with journalists, it was usually, whistleblowers were still talking to journalists, but it was small volumes of information which you would send or communicate with a journalist privately. But as we went on to the online world, we had certain really great challenges and also certain really great important benefits. Firstly, whistleblowers could give you vast amounts of information electronically from, say, the Iraq war logs or the Afghan war logs. So there was this electronic information availability, but there was also a huge amount of surveillance, as there is today. And there was this risk that whistleblowers, either their data would be insecure or they themselves would be put at risk. And so what WikiLeaks did was it created what is very new and very unusual, which is an electronic Dropbox. It's now used all over the world. 23 whistleblowing organizations and lots of newspapers have an electronic Dropbox. And WikiLeaks pioneered that. It also pioneered this idea of security of the document as well as security of the whistleblower. And it pioneered a very important step in journalism, which was to allow whistleblowers to talk to journalists, not just to those at the New York Times and the Guardian and the Washington Post who are interested in world events, perhaps self-censoring quite a lot because many of them are owned by oligarchs or oligopolists who allow a narrow range of debate, but also allowing whistleblowers to come in touch with local journalists, for example, in Tunisia, helping with the revolution there and the challenge of corrupt officials, in Africa, in various parts, allowing for corruption and the suppression of dissent to become more visible, and allowing us to scrutinize what's really going on in the world, for us to surveil the state rather than for Big Brother to look over our shoulders. And that was a huge step change in journalism, and Julian Assange is a very important journalist and publisher for allowing that. What he's also really important for is for being this small organization called WikiLeaks was standing up to the US State Department, to the CIA, and saying, we are going to reveal your crimes. We are going to reveal how you killed and raped and murdered and tortured hundreds of thousands of civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, and he did that, and they didn't like it.
They didn't like it. They told him to shut down. And the courage was where he stood up and continued to do it. Because if we talk about Black Lives Matter, the lives in Iraq and Afghanistan must count.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us.